terms of the teachings and beliefs of Chinese religions, we have mentioned that they are syncretic, but it's still possible to examine the fundamental characteristics of each religion. And once we've done that, we can look at their shared beliefs. Remember that religion, in the case of Chinese religions at any event, is considered a path of transformation. And because it is a path of transformation, that means it has both a process and a purpose. In Confucianism, there's first the question of what to learn. Confucius stated that by nature men are alike. By practice, men become far apart. And what he meant by this was we all start out about the same level of moral development and intellectual development, but once we grow up and we become adults and we go out into the world, there are tremendous differences from person to person, particularly, again, in terms of moral development. He said, for beginning your process of study, a young man should be devoted to his parents at home and respectful to his elders outside it. He should be cautious and truthful, love everyone, but only develop close relationships with good people. If he still has energy to spare after all this, he should study the classics. So clearly, for Confucianism, the moral component of self-cultivation is the primary, the foundation, the most important of all. Now, when he mentions the classics, studying the classics, Confucius was specifically speaking of the book of poetry, the book of history, the book of change, the book of rites or rituals, and the spring and autumn annals, for which he claimed one needed to study closely to learn the wisdom of the ancients who had come before him. However, over the centuries and over the millennia, new interpretations of what constitute the most important classics have come about. Confucius also insisted that the good self-cultivated person would learn the 6 arts: ritual, music, archery, calculation, calligraphy, and horsemanship. Now, some of these are practical applications. Why calligraphy? Well, as you can see in the picture of the calligrapher who's working there with his writing brush, calligraphy is not just for communication. It is also for beauty, and it is also a self-discipline. Confucius said that he who learns but does not think is lost. He who thinks but does not learn is in great danger. In other words, don't just memorize the classics. Don't just plan to spit out the information on tests. Ponder it deeply. Internalize the wisdom. On the other hand, don't just ponder deeply. Don't get lost inside yourself. Follow the guidelines of the ancients. Now, I mentioned the book of ritual, and ritual is very important to Confucius and continues to be important to Confucians, but there are different interpretations of this. He said, look at nothing in defiance of ritual. Listen to nothing in defiance of ritual. Speak of nothing in defiance of ritual. Never stir hand or foot in defiance of ritual. This might sound to us as if worrying too much about etiquette, worrying too much about the pomp and splendor of how one is performing one's duties was important. But for Confucius, ritual consisted of quite a wide range of actions. In fact, Confucius said there are 5 kinds of rituals in order of precedence. First, those rituals that are performed for deities and ancestral spirits, and also for deceased teachers such as some of the ancients. Confucius today is considered one of those first teachers. The second type of ritual, funerals. Now, of these first two out of the five, these should seem familiar to those of you who have studied other religions. These are typical religious types of rituals. But the third, Confucius said, was rituals for military events. For example, sending the army off to war, welcoming them back when they are victorious, promotion, and so on. The fourth ritual type concerns the treatment of guests, hospitality, and recognizing who gets precedence over someone else. This was particularly important at court. Finally, there are the special rites of passage, such as naming a baby, marriage, coming of age, those kinds of rituals. All of these together encompass what Confucius taught are the most central parts of being a human being in the midst of society. As we look at central virtues of Confucianism, we can see that this view of ritual is even more easy to understand. The first of these, ren, is putting one's human heart into all of one's interactions with others. Let's look at the character. On one side, on the left side, it is the character for person. On the other side, the right, it is the character for two. In other words, this is a virtue that one cannot attain and cannot display unless one is in the presence of other people. This is particularly important. If you think about other virtues in other religions, many of those can be achieved and carried out by oneself. Not so in Confucianism, and not so with Ren. So Confucius said, in enlarging oneself, seek also to enlarge others. Confucianism begins with the self, but moves outward toward family, toward all of society. Therefore, there is no such thing as a Confucian recluse, because self-transformation takes place in the midst of people. According to Confucius, there are 5 types of relationships that make up all of society, and ritual governs all of these relationships. There is the relationship between the parent and the child, the ruler and the subject, the husband and the wife, the elder brother or sibling and the younger sibling, and between friends. You'll notice that 4 of these 5 imply that there is a hierarchy or a dominance of one where the other is subject to the first. Not in the case of friends, unless one is considerably older than the other. So there are many minute versions of each of these categories. Now, these relationships are mutual. It is not just the case that the child is to be obedient to the parent, but that the parent is to nurture the child. The subject is to be loyal and dutiful to the ruler, but the ruler is to be a good ruler and make life possible and good, a livelihood good for the subjects. And the same thing goes for husband, wife, elder sibling, younger sibling. Another central Confucian tenet is filial piety. Filial comes from the Latin meaning son, and in this case it's the way that children behave toward their parents. The parent-child relationship of those 5 relationships is the most important. A child is 3 years old before he leaves the arms of his parents, Confucius says, and thus 3 years of mourning is universally observed. Filial piety is not just the way one behaves toward one's parents, but towards one's ancestors, the ancestors of the family, the ancestors of the clan, and even the ancestors of the community, some of whom may not be known or acknowledged. Finally, I'd like to mention, with regards to Confucianism, what I think of as the Confucian Revolution or the Confucian transformation. Why is self-transformation so important in Confucianism? It is not that one is trying to gain knowledge for the sake of knowledge, or even to develop one's moral character for one's own benefit. This personal transformation of skills, knowledge, and most of all moral character is the basis for harmony in the family and harmony in the social order. And the social order for Confucianism includes governance. So for Confucius, learning was no longer for the privileged few. At the time of Confucius and until shortly after his death, the only people who ruled in the government were the aristocrats. And so aristocratic privilege of study, of learning, of self-cultivation, even of things such as learning to paint, learning to be a good calligrapher, that was solely the province of the aristocracy, or, I like to say, the noblemen. Confucius was willing to teach any man who came to him. And so gradually he transformed not only the spiritual life, but all of Chinese socio-cultural belief by moving from the nobleman or aristocrat to the concept of the noble man, the junzi. Someone who was morally upright and who was also trained and capable and intelligent, and who would then rule in government. And it was from this foundation laid down by Confucius that the entire system of examinations came to be. You may have noticed when I was talking about the 5 relationships, and again when I'm talking about nobleman to nobleman, that this is gendered. Confucius did not champion women's rights. Later Confucians did talk about the role of women, sometimes exalted the roles of women, but they were never considered to be appropriate people to rule, appropriate people to label junzi. Turning to the path of transformation in Daoism, we find some tremendous differences. So for Daoists, personal transformation traditionally begins with retiring to a quiet mountain or a forest retreat to learn how the Dao works in the world and find it within oneself. And so this is very different from the Confucian teaching that one cannot cultivate oneself unless one is in the midst of people. As Daoism is practiced currently, it was also a means of cultivating one's health, one's good health, one's growth, and offshoots even took this to a greater extent by claiming that Daoism was the search for immortality, personal immortality. This is why in Daoist temples we see pictures of the 8 immortals who all had histories as real people. And then, of course, there were others who achieved the deity-type status. So this was an ideal that one could strive for oneself. Central Daoist virtues include, and concepts include, living according to the Dao. But what is the Dao? So the first real description, and it's not actually a very helpful description that we have of Dao, is the opening lines of the Daodejing by Laozi. Dao ke dao, fei dao ye. The way that you can call the way, where you can point to it and say, aha, that's the way, isn't the real way. isn't the complete way, because it is so enormous that there is no way that words can describe it. The Dao consists of the movement of yin and yang in the world when they are unimpeded. And unimpeded is important because one of the most important values in Taoism is wu wei, or non-interference. That means not interfering with the natural order of the world, going with the shape of events rather than resisting or fighting the natural order of things. So at one point it is said that the Tao abides in non-action, yet nothing is left undone. If kings and lords observed this, the 10,000 things, that is all the things in the world, would develop naturally. In other words, as long as it is left to go through all of its transformations in a natural form, the world, which is governed by the Tao, will be fine. It doesn't need anyone to interfere and fix things. And that includes people, because the individual is a microcosm of the macrocosm. So the same Tao that regulates the world also regulates each individual. And if people who were governing would just pay attention to that and not be impatient and not be controlling, then there would be no need for government. There would be no need for rules and laws and so on. Everything would naturally fall into or tend toward harmony. There is an example from Zhuangzi about a river that is flowing fast, and yet in the center there's a big rock. According to the Tao, because rivers move according to the Tao, the river does not attempt to batter the rock, to get rid of it right away. Instead, it flows around it. Some of it flows above it or over it, and gradually, maybe over decades, maybe over centuries, as in the case of the Grand Canyon, over millennia, the rock is worn down. And the river has achieved this naturally. There has been no need to force anything. Another central tenet of Taoism is the cyclical change of the world, which makes sense if you're thinking about yin and yang and how they move. Daoists suggest that you observe, say, the growth of a seed to a seedling, to a sapling, to a tree, which flourishes, drops its own type of seeds, acorns or some other type, and eventually grows so old that it dies, it falls to the ground, it decays, and it fertilizes the new seeds. We can understand from this kind of example that Taoists believe, first of all, that the world is in a constant state of flux, as yin forces and yang forces, the positive and the negative, the light and the dark, and so on, mix. And second, that nothing remains static. A great example of this is Zhuangzi's attitude and behavior when his wife died. It was well known by their friends that he loved her very much. So when a friend came by to pay his respects and offer condolences on the death of Zhuangzi's wife, he was astonished to see that Zhuangzi was sitting on the ground with his legs crossed, pounding on a drum and singing at the top of his lungs. Zhuangzi answered, "When she died, how could I not feel grief? However, she was lifeless before she was born. She was also formless, and there was no energy that was her. But somewhere in the vast, imperceptible universe, there was a change, some infusion of energy, and then she was born into form and into life. Now her form has changed again, and she's dead. Such death and life are like the natural cycles of the 4 seasons. My dead wife is now resting between heaven and earth. If I were to wail at the top of my voice to express my grief, it would certainly indicate that I don't understand what is fated. Therefore, I stopped. The movement of yin and yang is mirrored in everything in the universe. And all opposites are relative states, such as the life and death of Zhuangzi's wife. At one point, he explained that he fell asleep and dreamed that he was a butterfly. And it was an extremely vivid dream. He truly believed he was a butterfly. Then he woke up, and it was a little bit of a shock to discover that he was a person. And then he asked himself, was I Zhuangzi, dreaming I was a butterfly? Or am I now really a butterfly dreaming that I'm Zhuangzi? So waking and sleeping, also opposites, are also relative states of being. Looking at this as opposites being two sides of the same coin is a very Daoist perspective on life. And this realization is described as being very liberating. It freed Zhuangzi, as he said, to ride the wind, to leap impossible mountains, and so on. Because, of course, if the opposite of a mountain is either a flat land or a hole, then he should be able to jump either one. So the basic tenets of Confucianism and Daoism appear to be in opposition to each other. We know what a Daoist would say about that, don't we? What do they have in common? One of the important things that both Confucianism and Daoism have in common is the idea of doing what comes naturally, spontaneity. So the Daoist doesn't interfere. The Daoist does not strive for anything, including self-improvement or governing. Confucius took a different approach. He said, when I was 15, I decided to study. At 30, I was a confirmed student. At 40, nothing could move me from my course. At 50, I understood the will and decrees of heaven. At 60, I was attuned to them. And at 70, I could follow my heart's desire, never overstepping the lines of rectitude. So Confucius eventually got to the point of being able to act spontaneously, but only through diligent study and a long time. So according to Daoism, we find the Tao within ourselves. According to Confucianism, we internalize the Tao from external sources. I hope this helps you understand in what sense Confucianism and Daoism are paths of transformation, and the difference between the two of them, and how they can be practiced syncretically, even though they appear to be in opposition to one another.